Hi everyone, it's Kit here again for another installment in our video series on domain knowledge around the vCops suite. Now this one today is not exactly on the vCops suite, it's more of this design principle that I think we as a team really need to internalize in order to execute the best that we can. And it's called the art of good enough. So now you may be asking yourself, okay, Kit, so what's the deal? Why good enough? And more importantly, why not great? Isn't that what we should shoot for? And I think that is the engineer's mentality, right? It's to shoot for great. Great offers this sort of blue sky future with an open problem space where we can solve all the problems of our existing infrastructure. We can, in a word, achieve perfection. That's essentially what we try to shoot for every time, this thing that can solve everything. Now, unfortunately, great also has some downsides. That even if you can solve all these problems, you generally speaking create new ones. And you lose something that I call legacy in the code. If you have a piece of code that's been around for a number of years, you've done tons of bug fixes, gotten tons of customer feedback, added all sorts of supporting code for like little corner cases and so forth. And all that gets thrown away when you create something completely new from scratch. So we really have to say, I think to ourselves, is it worthwhile losing all that? Because most importantly, there is a long tail of effort as well. Whenever you build something from scratch, from the ground up, it always takes much longer than you think, and you always tend to overshoot. So great is sort of the siren song, I think of it as. It whispers in your ear, and you want to go toward it. But it does have some downsides. And I think in the end, what we think of great is not really what I would call great, or what great actually is, in my opinion. Because what we think of great is actually perfection. As I said, we want to create this perfect system that can solve every problem that it faces. My argument today is actually that great is really good enough done right. So that begs the question, well, what is good enough? Glad you asked. Okay, so here we are now, right? And I think as engineers, we shoot for great because that's what we do. We're going to build this new system from the ground up, re-architect it, make it perfectly scalable and extensible and flexible and powerful. Just make it perfect, right? And we think to ourselves, okay, well, we're going to shoot for great. We probably won't get there, especially on the first release, because, hey, it takes a while to get there. And if we miss great, well, where do we end up? Good enough, right? Because good enough is just a little bit less than great. And so if we shoot for great and we miss, then we'll get good enough. My argument is actually that we don't get good enough. You get screwed. You can get badly screwed. Because what happens when you aim for great is that you throw away everything you have, you start from scratch and build up this infrastructure. And a lot of times that infrastructure never gets finished. And if you don't finish it, then you have nothing. You're actually worse off than you were when you started because now you've spent all this time and resources on something that gave you nothing. Because in reality, good enough is a very different direction from great. It's something that's fundamentally different in that if you want to do good enough, then you need to aim for it initially and not just assume that it'll be just a little bit less than great. Now, I understand this is a fairly abstract concept, so let me try and put it into some more realistic terms. I live in San Francisco, and in San Francisco, it's a small city, geographically speaking. Public transit's a really big thing. And when you think about great public transit, you think about subways. They're fast, they're underground, so they're not really held up by any sort of traffic issues. They're long trains, so they can get a lot of people on them. But subways are pretty expensive, right? And they take a long time to build. You got to build tunnels and everything. It's a lot of effort. On the other hand, you have buses, and buses are what I would qualify as good enough. They're way slower than subways. Subways, can hit 50 miles an hour easy. Buses in San Francisco average about 8 miles an hour. And they're constantly at red lights. It's a real pain. Buses are smaller than the subways, so there's a lot of negatives. But on the plus side, they're cheap. You can buy a bus pretty easily and make a new bus route without too much effort. Now, in particular, within San Francisco today, this is going on. We're actually trying to create a new subway line, and it's about 1.5 miles long. Its estimated cost is going to be $1.5 billion, and they will have spent 20 years planning it and building it by the time it's done. So all that, $1.5 billion in 20 years for a 1.5 mile stretch of subway. Now let's layer on top of that the existing bus route today. So as you can see in this picture, there's at least 40 different buses just within this tiny little piece of San Francisco. And as a matter of fact, the exact street under which they're building the subway, there's already 3 bus lines, one of which is an express. So you might argue, well, we just need more buses. Let's just add another one, right? It's 2 million and a little bit of planning. So how can you justify the subway when you have all these buses? How do you justify it being great? But let's say you do, and you say, you know what? We're going to shoot for great. We're going to go and build a subway. So you say, okay, I'm going to aim for the subway. I'm going to go for it. Now you say, well, I didn't get my funding, or the neighborhoods didn't want it. They didn't want the subway station, you know. And so let's say you fail at getting the great, which is the subway. So what do you get? Do you get good enough? Do you get a new bus route? Does that suddenly materialize out of this subway they were building? And the answer is, of course, no. No, you don't get a bus route. You get a bunch of half-built subway stations. I mean, this is what San Francisco looks like in this stretch here. Union Square is all under construction, and there's deep holes in the ground. That's what you end up with. You're much worse off than you were before because you wanted to build this infrastructure, but you only got halfway there. So if you wanted to go a bus route, it's completely different set of people, different planning process, different way of doing it completely. So the point here is that good enough is very different from great and is not just some subset of it. So how do we get there? I think the most important thing for good enough is to be able to look at the big picture. I like to use this example of the iPhone. Was the original iPhone great, the iPhone 2G? Now on the surface, when you look at it, you're like, wow, that thing had nothing. It didn't have 3G, didn't have GPS, couldn't put any other apps on it. Its notification system was terrible and continued to be terrible for many years. It, as a phone, is still terrible. Doesn't have a physical keyboard. It's got all these shortcomings. But they did do one thing that was just so stellarly amazing, and that was the web. They had a web browser. They had a great, simple, all-you-can-eat data plan. Made everything very simple. And because of that, the iPhone was great. Now, if you think about it, the engineers on the iPhone, they must have gone crazy over these things like the weak notification system. How could any engineer let that out the door and put their name on that? The thing is so bad, but nevertheless, it went out the door. And the point is that no one really cared. I mean, yeah, it was bad, but it didn't matter because the point was they had something that was so good, and that was the web. So you really have to look at the big picture for good enough. What are the truly important things that differentiate your product? Those are the ones you focus on. The other ones, if you have time, great. If not, well, it's okay. So, as I said, as you apply these, prioritize mercilessly. That means saying no to a lot. That means just feeling crazy bad about having to say no to these things. You're like, I can't believe we're doing this. But you can do it, and it's okay. We do it all the time. The important thing is that if you prioritize properly, then you'll get the important stuff done, and that's what matters. Similarly speaking, with coding, optimize the code that doesn't. If it's not on the critical path, it probably doesn't need to be optimized. You can keep the code simpler and just let it be until it does become a problem. You should generalize your code, but only if you know there are specific uses of that generalization. That doesn't mean you shouldn't make it data-driven. Making it data-driven is, I think, always a good idea, or almost always. But how much you generalize is something you really want to think about. And you want to be okay with some cleanliness. Code gets written for various reasons at various times. Some of it's not always that clean, and that's okay. You have to hold your nose for some of those things. So I think the point here is that when I think of good enough, I don't think of something half-assed. I don't think of something as hacky. That's not what good enough means to me. To me, good enough is all about the intelligent use of resources to maximize the amount of value that you deliver. We have a limited amount of time and a limited amount of resources. How can we produce the best thing? We cannot achieve perfection, and if we try, we will most likely fail. So instead, we have to take a different direction. We have to think differently. And that's what we all need to do as a team. So I'm hoping that we can all step up and think good enough.